Thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you this morning and a great privilege to have the opportunity to share the work of SAFCEI over the past 16 years. And so I've got a little bit of a whistle-stop tour presentation for you today. And I'm going to go through the work of SAFCEI, what we've been doing regionally with faith communities working on environmental and climate justice. And Mike gave me some pointers before I came today about what you might be interested in. So I know you're having presentations from others focusing more on climate change. So while climate change is central to all of our work at SAFCEI, I'm going to focus more on the work of faith communities on environmental justice, although the two aren't really separated. I'm just going to go to the next slide. Let me just make sure I'm doing this. It's a little slow. There we go. Hope you can see slide 2. Yes. Okay. So SAFCEI is the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute. We are a multi-faith organization, and we use terms very specifically. Multi-faith has a particular meaning, which I'll go into in more detail later on. And we are committed to raising awareness, understanding, and action on eco-justice, sustainable living, and climate change. Faith is very central to what we do. We emphasize the spiritual and moral imperative of caring for the earth and the community of life, all life on earth. And this is really around ethical governance, leadership, and really finding ways to inculcate this within our communities across Africa. And you'll see here, this picture here, I chose this specifically for this presentation. These are faith leaders, and you'll see there's some puppet heads representing different denominations, including Christian, Muslim, and African traditional. Those are the big puppet heads you can see, and then I hope you can see that clearly. And then there's also faith leaders and community activists, all standing outside Parliament in South Africa. And this is during the height of our campaign against the corrupt and illegal nuclear energy deal that happened in South Africa in 2017. And I'll talk more about that in a little while. And I just want to also say that CPLO have been long partners of ours. Mike and his colleagues are there right next door to Parliament. That's where their offices are. So they've been fantastic supporters of our work and also given us opportunities to learn from others with the particular lens that they bring around Parliament and governance. So right now, SAFCEI has a team of 13, and 2 of my colleagues are here today, who you heard from. That's Sandra and Wayne. And they may have to pop in and out a little bit, but I'm very glad they could come. And we also have 7 board members, and we're a broad spectrum of different faiths. So this is the multi-faith aspect. African traditional healers, Baha'i, Buddhist, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Quaker, and of course, the wide range of Christian denominations, which, as you know, across Africa is more than 70, sometimes up to 90% of all people of faith. This is the staff team last year. You may recognize some of these wonderful faces. And in this picture, in fact, Sandra is a new member of the team, so she's not there, but Wayne is in the back row there. So yeah, we're very lucky to have a fantastic team that we work with. And this is at our offices in Cape Town. So as I said, we're a regional entity, and we are committed to this caring for living earth, this sacred commitment. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about how SAFCEI was founded. So why did SAFCEI come about? Well, a group of faith leaders met together at the Hartbeespoort Dam, and we're talking about this real urgency around the lack of care for creation amongst religious institutions, and the need for this to be brought into the central objectives of the church and of all faiths. So this is the group of faith leaders. You can see it's a wide variety of individuals who came together and said, yes, we want to do this. Yes, we want to start SAFCEI. And the people who really brought SAFCEI into existence were Bishop Jeff Davies, who's an Anglican bishop here in the Cape, and his wife, Kate Davies. She's an environmental educator, and it's a real marriage. The vision of SAFCEI was a real marriage of the issue of environmental education, the knowledge of the environment, and the church. And that's where SAFCEI started in 2005. And I have a special link to SAFCEI myself personally, because I previously worked for a well-known African environmentalist, a Kenyan woman called Professor Wangari Maathai. And she started an organization known as the Greenbelt Movement. Many of you will have heard of her. She became the first African woman and the first environmentalist globally to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, also in 2005. And at the launch of SAFCEI, Wangari was there, and she planted a tree with SAFCEI. And I was living in London, and I started working with Wangari and the Greenbelt Movement at that time. Working on climate policy and their relationships into Europe. So, and unfortunately, Professor Maathai, or Prof, as we used to call her, and many people who understand the deep spiritual calling to care for the environment. And I'm sure many of you have that connection because you're taking the time to learn about this issue. There's ethical issues around protection of environment for faith institutions to look at. But there's also really this sacred text tell us about how it is, what is our role, what is our responsibility, what does justice mean for those most vulnerable in communities? And this is what many faith leaders and faith communities are called to do. And this slide in front of you tells you a little bit why we work with faith leaders. Why do we work with faith communities? We believe that we are indeed, from many different faith perspectives, unified from our sacred text, from our values, to work together to care for creation. I often try to explain this difference between multi-faith and interfaith in this way. Interfaith is when you're having a dialogue where you're discussing your faith differences or similarities. So it's a deeper dive into different faith perspectives. Whereas a multi-faith, you're collectively standing together and looking at the issue that you want to work on. And this has a remarkable impact we found through our work with SAFCEI, that by focusing on perhaps a river cleanup or an environmental law which is very damaging, or a lack of access to electricity that's affordable, by focusing on collective issues together, faith communities come together and work together incredibly well. And that's what we call the multi-faith approach. So you can see all the other reasons why faith leaders and faith communities are so important in this space, that are trusted, have a moral authority, have a structure with which to work with communities and those most vulnerable. And so SAFCEI has really formulated what it needs to do over the years quite strongly. So very concerned with raising environmental awareness, looking at policy and ethical guidelines within faith communities, facilitating environmental responsibility and action, confronting injustices, and supporting training and learning. And I have to say that from my perspective, and Mike asked me to give a little bit of feedback on this. And Mike, I also want to ask you, please, to keep me to time. If you can let me know when I'm sort of halfway through and maybe 5 minutes left, that would be really helpful. But I just wanted to say that some of these objectives that we've had, these 5 objectives, some were better at than others. I would say we're very good at number 1, but number 2, the formulating policy and ethical guidelines within faith communities, within faith institutions, I would say that really isn't SAFCEI's role as such. We can support faith leaders to do so, but bringing about a change within the faith institution itself is quite a challenge. As we know, in the Catholic faith community, you've got a tremendous leader at the top with Pope Francis and the Laudato Si and the amazing work that's happening actually from the Vatican. And then you've got the grassroots community and the faith leaders across the world who are busy taking action on the environment. But yet, not all the Catholic community are completely aware of that. In fact, I have a good Catholic friend who I said to her, the Pope's encyclical on the environment, and she hadn't heard of it. And she was quite a devout Catholic. So I was quite surprised. So I think for us, in terms of SAFCEI, that's a tricky one, that's objective number 2, but I think it's very important. So we do like to discuss that, but I think that's really something that happens from within a faith, and it's a long process. The others, I would say, we're reasonably effective in them. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of our campaigns and the difficulty of addressing environmental issues as a small NGO. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit more about what is the meaning of this word eco-justice. Eco comes from the root word God's house, or oikos, which is both a root for ecology and economy. So when we talk about ecology, we're really talking about this framework within which we live. And for me, really, ecology encompasses more of nature and more of the sacred than economy. But, some people say that there is a soul in money, so we shouldn't forget that in terms of economy. And justice for the planet is also justice for people. So we see that these aspects of economic justice, social justice, and environmental justice are all linked. And that's why we call it eco-justice. This picture here is us marching on the courthouse when we had taken the South African government to court on its corrupt nuclear deal. And that's us marching down, just about to arrive at the courthouse in 2017. Mike, I hope I'm going a good pace for the translator. If I need to pause more, happy to do that. Just let me know if you'd like me to speak a little slower. I am a quick speaker.
I think if you just take a little breath at the end of every second sentence and just maybe count to 3 or 4, that'll be fine.
Okay. I know how hard it is, and thank you, translator. Okay. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about eco-justice and the principles therein. There are 6 eco-justice principles. Firstly, the intrinsic worth of the universe, Earth, and all of its components. Secondly, this principle of interconnectedness. We are mutually dependent on each other. We live here together, and not just the living things, but all things on the earth, in the universe. Thirdly, this principle of voice. The earth can also raise its own voice in celebration and against injustice. And so we are the voice of the earth. Very interesting concept that. Who am I speaking on behalf of when I speak about injustice? Fourthly, the principle of purpose. The universe and all of its components are part of a dynamic cosmic design. So we each have our own piece. That's sort of sacred geometry, as you hear sometimes. And this is where science and religion or faith often link up together. We see it in the theories of physics, even in climate change. There are aspects which really speak to us being in a system which relates to each other, this relational situation. Then the 5th principle is one of custodianship. So not having dominion over Earth, but rather being at one with Earth, a part of the web of life. You can see here ego, which is some of the more traditional doctrine. You can call it some aspects of religion suggest this, of man having dominion over nature. But when we talk of eco, you can see that we are all within the web, equal to each other. It's a circle. And many concepts in environmentalism talk about circular economies, talk about webs, a very different way of looking at the world. And then sixthly, we've got this principle of resistance, that we need to actively resist exploitation and abuse in our struggle for justice. And again, this is a very common concept in many faiths. Mahatma Gandhi really embodied this in his peaceful resistance. He wasn't a violent man, but he wouldn't stand for abuse. Very interesting. And faith, this is a place where faith leaders have played an enormously important role in Africa. We've seen it in many countries, and I'm sure in some of your countries, you see faith leaders are able to stand up and speak up on injustice. Sometimes even they fall to severe governance issues. But faith leaders have a very particular role here. So now going back to SAFCEI and a little bit more about how we formulate our work, having understood some of the principles of where we start from, we identified 6 thematic areas for focus. The first one is energy and climate justice. The second one is food and climate justice. The fourth one is animal justice. The fifth one is land and water justice. Oh, sorry. The sixth one is biodiversity loss, and I've somehow got my numbering wrong. Here we have one called, and we have faith leader and environmental advocacy. That's not actually one of the thematic areas. That's a training platform. And I should have checked this slide. The other one is planetary boundaries. I'm not going to go into most of these thematic areas, only 3 that SAFCEI focuses on. And you'll be seeing those in the following slides. So I'll go into those programmatic areas. Land and water justice, biodiversity, and planetary boundaries are not areas that we focus on at present. They're integrated into our other programs, but they are thematic areas of importance to us. Right, so I'm going to now talk a little bit more about our programs. As I just mentioned, we've got 3 thematic areas that we focus on at the moment. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about each of those. And this has grown for us over the years. This is a slide that tells you a little bit about what we achieved in 2020 and how we were working during this period. And you can see sort of some of the ways that we've been working, which includes workshops, meetings and conferences, making policy submissions, providing support to faith communities, conducting research, conducting campaigns. And then we also wanted to show the issue of gender within our work. When we talk about eco-justice, we're not separate from the other issues of imbalance in society or inequality. And gender is one of the issues that comes out very strongly as soon as you start looking at environment and climate issues. We're also very aware that we're working in a context of COVID-19. So last year, we really had to adjust how we work. And we're doing a lot of this online meeting now, like this one, which the silver lining of COVID is that we've learned how to share information on platforms such as Zoom, which means we can reach out to many faith leaders and faith communities who we couldn't connect with otherwise. So that's the great privilege that today brings us, that we've been able to connect like this, which is really wonderful. We also have done some analysis about how we work in relation to sustainable development goals. So while we know that faith leaders have a very particular role to play in their societies and communities, We also want to show that our work is linked entirely to the SDGs. And this is all information that I'd be very happy to share with you later. Just wanted to share with you some of the analysis that we've been doing to show how important the work of faith leaders is in relation to these UN goals, these global goals to address poverty and other issues. Okay, so now I'm going to start getting into our first program area, which is the Energy and Climate Justice Program.
Francesca, maybe just a little bit slower still. A little bit slower for the interpreter.
I will try. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, interpreter. Energy and climate justice. This is one of SAFCEI's oldest program areas. We've worked on it for many years now. And SAFCEI's SAFCEI is best known for taking the South African government to court over its nuclear deal, which I mentioned previously. This nuclear deal was corrupt and unconstitutional and ruled by the court. Nuclear energy is a complex issue. Many governments in Africa are suggesting that this could be the way to provide energy to their populations and also address climate change. That is, as faith leaders, we can say a morally incorrect conclusion for a number of reasons. And I don't want to spend all my time with you today talking about nuclear energy. But I can tell you that the science and our faiths call on us to stand up against nuclear energy. It's too costly financially. It's too costly for the environment. It's too costly for communities to afford it in terms of the electricity cost. So it's costly to build, costly for the communities to access the energy, costly for the environment. And I'm using costly as a term to cover all the aspects about safe, affordable, and accessible energy for our community. We don't need, and many African communities are still dependent on biomass, on wood, on firewood to heat their food, to look after their energy needs. We don't need to go from forests, which is unsustainable, to nuclear, which is unsustainable, as a climate change solution. We need to go to renewable energy. And that is very clear at SAFCEI because of all the research we've done. And the problem with nuclear energy is that it's a big ticket item, which creates a graft opportunity or a corruption opportunity for governments. And we all know when governments start doing these very, very big projects, millions upon millions is wasted. And Africa is not a poor continent, but we cannot afford nuclear energy, and neither do we need it. It's unnecessary. And this is a very important piece of work that we continue to do. We continue to face the spectra of nuclear energy in South Africa. Our government is still pushing for nuclear energy. And we've seen in Zimbabwe, in Zambia, and many other, Nigeria, Ghana, many other countries, many other governments are signing agreements with Russia and Rosatom to have nuclear energy installed. Very important message for faith leaders to say we do not need dirty nuclear energy. We need the energy that was given to us Some people say the energy that was given to us by God. Sun and wind, we are wealthy in this. Let's use that energy. And you can see that we have campaigned with many faith leaders across South Africa on this issue, but also in the region. Very important issue. And this slide summarizes what I've just been saying, and I'll let the translator just read it out to you all, in case I'm still talking a little quickly. So when we talk about this, we're talking about this just transition, which many of you have heard. It's a term that's come up within the climate justice spaces. We're talking about moving us from biomass or coal or any of the extractive energies, or even perhaps new gas and oil that we're seeing emerging in our countries, and not using those, but using renewable energy, using energy that will actually meet the needs of the citizens in Africa and the needs of faith communities. And faith leaders and faith communities have a very important role to play in this. Because you can say this is morally bad decision making and challenge your governments and show ways to divest from the fossil fuel industry and invest in renewable energy. Faith community networks that go from the top, for example, with the Pope, right down into every community across the continent. The Catholic Church is probably one of the best well-networked entities. What a tremendous opportunity to give affordable energy access to your community. And there's many ways we can do this. In fact, many people want to invest and join hands with faith communities to leapfrog from fossil fuels and leapfrog from centralized energy systems into decentralized, accessible, affordable systems. So I want to put to you today, this is really a place that you can play and we can play in our communities. So here's one more slide, just showing you about this issue of why not nuclear energy. It's a very bad choice. It costs the earth. It doesn't work during the COVID pandemic and the weak economy. We have many financial woes in governments. And who pays? As usual, the consumer pays. And this is why we cannot afford it. It's not just South Africa. I would like to just cross that south out and say Africa cannot afford nuclear energy. And this isn't because of some poverty issue. No, it's about making good, ethical energy decisions. Okay, so that was, as I said at the beginning, I'm doing a whistle-stop tour through our programs. And just to say, again, on this slide, Mike, you were asking me, where have we seen success and where have we found it more difficult? So on nuclear energy and energy decision-making in South Africa, we won the court case. It was a landmark decision, no more nukes. These are corrupt, these deals. But as I said earlier, the spectra has returned. And you will know, all of you, from working in your own communities, that often it's a, I hate to use sort of military or war analogies, but you know that saying, when the battle was won, but the war continues? It's unfortunately kind of like that. And I think in terms of our faith calling, it's about being called to be present, to persist, and to remain committed to seeing it through. It's that custodianship. You know, when one has custodianship, you don't just do something once, you keep doing it until the end, which may be the end of your life and you pass it on to someone else, or until the issue really has been resolved. So this issue has not been resolved yet. In fact, across Africa, it's growing and becoming a bigger problem. So while we've had some success, yes, and we want to celebrate the successes because they were hard won and very taxing, we know that there's still much for us to do. And across the region, it's a regional issue. Right, okay, so on to another aspect of SAFCEI's work. We also work on food and climate justice. This is a relatively new program for us. We've been doing it for 3 years now, and we are looking at this industrialization of food in Africa in relation to the climate change. And as we know, our small-scale farmers, and everyone knows maybe their grandmother or where they grew up, is usually somewhere with a piece of land where food is grown. And there's all sorts of delicious crops, food systems, traditional ways of growing food, traditional ways of eating food. It's full of nutrition. It makes you feel healthy. And we know, and this is the food system across the world, not just on our continent. We know that as we've become urbanized, so our the nutritional value of our food has gone down. And we've seen human health has deteriorated. But in a rural setting or traditional food systems, there's a cultural, religious, and community practice, which keeps communities more healthy and more in harmony with the land. So when we look at food, we know that this is an issue of justice. Many families who are now living in the cities, and I'm sure many of you could say, they are experiencing hunger, they're experiencing malnutrition, and it's a right of all people to land, to water, to health, to a healthy environment. And as we see the impact of climate change, so we see communities becoming vulnerable, even the rural farmers who have lived in harmony for many years with the land, starting to be at risk because of climate change. So food is a justice issue. And I started talking about this before. Why is it that there's a problem with our food system? These are some of the reasons. And I'm going to let the translator read these to you who are having the translation while I speak. And I'll go through them as well. So our food system is becoming centralized and concentrated. It means that we are having to pay more for bad quality food. Producers cannot afford to sustain themselves or their food community. You know, when you're a small-scale farmer and you're told by government or one of the big systems that are coming in, grow this cash crop, you don't have enough land to grow that cash crop to make enough money to sustain yourself. And then you are faced with a depleted soil, and your children aren't getting nutritious food either. So it's a no-win situation. So what we're seeing is that it's not that we don't have enough food in Africa, it's a matter of access. So there's a very important distinction in this issue around access to food versus, or access to nutritious food versus being able to produce enough. And it's an argument that we want to dissuade people to believing. It's the type of food that we're producing, not the amount of food. So we're seeing this general erosion of social cultural practices, of ecological resilience, and this makes us even more vulnerable to climate change. And unfortunately, this is something we're seeing within the political economy of Southern Africa and beyond. So this investment in industrialized food systems, governments like it, they get supported by other governments to do it. It's another example of poor policy decision-making. And we at SAFCEI have been looking specifically at AGRA, the Alliance for the Green Revolution in Africa. That's been going since almost as long as SAFCEI, 2006. Data shows that they aren't having any impact on poverty, on access to nutritional food, and billions have been invested into AGRA by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others, governments included. So they've bought into the lie that we need to industrialize our food systems to feed ourselves. But this isn't the truth. In fact, making seeds inaccessible to smallholder farmers actually reduces our resilience and reduces our capacity to feed ourselves and to be climate resilient. Bringing in fertilizers and pesticides actually reduces the health and biodiversity of the soil. So this is a big issue, AGRA, because they attract millions and billions. They're working across Africa, changing food laws with governments and moving us into this monocrop system. Oh, okay, so that's all the slides on food and climate justice. We have some wonderful campaign activities in this area. There's a faith leader sign-on letter, which you can still sign on if you want, saying we don't want industrial food systems. It's directed at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in particular. And we're working with AFSA, which is the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, AFSA. And I can share more details of that later. This is a big challenge. And as I said before, SAFCEI has only recently started working on food and climate justice. But the feedback from the faith communities we work with is that food is a vitally important issue. And it's one of the places that really touches us in our homes. How we eat is so personal. And yet there's this big issue behind us as it becomes more convenient to eat food and access food. Thank you, Wayne, for sharing that link in the chat. Thank you. You can see that there. As it becomes more convenient to buy food at the supermarket, so actually our cultural practices and our foods that really are full of nutritional value, that's getting eroded, and the ecology and so on. So this is a very important issue for us, but I do feel that I need to keep an eye on time. And so I'm going to move along to our final third program area, which is animal justice. And you might ask yourself, that's quite not as independent an issue as energy and food. And yes, this is linked entirely to industrialization of our food system. Our animal justice work has a very specific focus on getting hens out of cages, because within the industrial food system, hens are some of the most cruelly treated animals within our food system. So why does SAFCEI focus on animal justice? Well, all of our faiths have this golden rule. It's common across all the faiths. Do unto others what you would have done unto you. It's a fundamental underpinning of our faith. And our mission is to care for living Earth, which is about showing compassion and mercy to all living beings and everyone that is in this Earth community, the rivers, the forests, the trees, and all the beings. We don't see ourselves as being more important to all of those beings. It really is a sacred spiritual connection that we feel to the Earth. And I'm sure you feel the same way. We call ourselves Earth Keepers. Earth Keepers is a term that SAFCEI uses to describe the commitment and action we take as individuals. So we're part of a global campaign called the Open Wing Alliance. The Open Wing Alliance, which works together across the world and has had tremendous success in getting retailers, supermarkets, restaurant chains, hotels to stop using eggs from caged hens. It's a simple animal welfare issue. And if we're eating an animal that's unhealthy and full of antibiotics, ultimately affects us. So seeing us as being in sacred connection. We don't want hens living in cages. Here's some of the reasons, but I'm going to quickly rush through this because I do have a number of other slides that I want to share with you and some of the more about our other work. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I am aware, I think I have maybe another 10 minutes or so, I think, Mike, if I'm correct. So I'm just going to go a little bit faster now, but you can get a copy of this and look more at this issue.
Francesca, take as much time as you need. Don't feel that you need to rush.
Thanks, Mike. I also wanted to say that maybe after I go through these 3 programs, should I pause for questions or what do you suggest? I know it gets tiring listening to someone for so long. So I'll just finish this one and then we can have a pause and maybe do something a little bit more interactive.
Okay, that's fine.
Great, thanks. Okay, so I think also many people say that, having access to meat or eggs is, just being able to get those foodstuffs is such of nutritional value. We can't worry about what's happening to the animals or the eggs. And I think from our perspective is that it's a human right to have access to nutritional, healthy food. And if we're doing this to other species, then you know that ultimately it's going to impact on us. Even COVID-19 has been shown to be a zoonotic disease, which means it's transferred from other species to us. And the more that we erode into wildlands and the more that we mistreat other species, the more likely these viruses will transfer into the human society and impact us negatively. So when we talk about the need to care for hens as we care for ourselves, if we don't do that, nature will bite us back. And that's something that we've seen time and time again. We know it from the Bible with Noah and the ark, when the waters rose. We've seen many times pestilence and other things come down on earth when humans are living out of balance with the earth. So it's not something that's new, but it is something that is our current challenge in society, to really find ways to work more in balance. So we've done some really fun campaigns on cage-free. We campaigned against McDonald's. And you may not know this, but McDonald's actually globally have said that they will go cage-free. So there's some very interesting work that's already been done that you may never have even heard of. And I wonder how far across our continent McDonald's is. I suspect they're in a lot of countries. And, so it's organized, it's restaurant chains and others like that we campaign against globally and also in South Africa. This is a South African restaurant, Wimpy. And I'm sure you've probably heard of them. Steers and others, Mug and Bean. Famous Brands is the overarching company, and we campaigned against them too. and got them to pledge to go cage-free. And they've been amazing. They're almost cage-free already. So it's really about saying we're committing to changing our supply chain, and it works. It's an amazing campaign. More, of course, needs to be done, but just bringing that ethical, environmental, animal justice awareness into businesses, we feel is a wonderful achievement of people of faith. Really saying to them, come on, let's be a little bit more ethical, have a bit more of the sacred in our decision making. Okay, Mike, I'm going to pause there. The next group of slides is about sort of more how we work with faith communities, but I think it's a good moment to pause and to see if anyone wants to chat a bit. I can also stop sharing. We can have a bit more of a round conversation, and we can come back to that.
Yeah, okay, let's do that. So you do have some further slides that you want to show us, but we'll take a quick, not a break, but we'll just open it up now to anybody who has questions or comments on what you've heard up to this stage. So please, you know how to do it. Just unmute yourself, switch your video on if you want to, and let's see if you have any particular questions or comments to make.
We'll also give the translator a little pause.
Yes.
Really, any questions if you didn't catch it, something that I said, or if there's anything that you'd like to know a little bit more about, I can go into that. We can just have a little pause and then I'll go back if people don't have a question.
And as I've mentioned before, you're also welcome to put questions in the chat box if you prefer to do it that way.
What about you, Mike? Have you got any questions so far?
I wanted to just raise the latest suspicious development in electricity generation. These power ships, as they're called, car power ships. Maybe many of our guests won't be familiar, but the idea is that you have a floating power station. It's a big ship. I believe mostly they belong to Turkish companies, and they come and they anchor off your coast, and they run mostly off gas, I think, and oil. And it's a floating power station. And our government is wanting to contract with the company that owns these ships over a 20-year period to have these ships anchored in 3 of our harbors for the next 20 years at an incredible cost to help to generate electricity. And I'm wondering what SAFCEI's position is on that idea.
Yeah, Mike, it's a huge worry. This is another example of where our government in South Africa, and different countries have got different issues, but the South African government, having been an industrialized nation, very dependent on mining, very dependent on fossil fuels to power its energy systems, its electricity systems, continues to seek these kinds of climate disastrous ways of bringing energy onto the grid and disincentivizing renewable energy. So we haven't had any big renewable energy projects generated from government in the last 3 to 5 years. They literally stalled and blocked renewable energy, which recent research and studies have shown that now renewable energy is so cheap that to install and put renewable energy onto your electricity grid is cheaper than to continue running coal-powered power plants. So it's even if you have to do the startup of coal, of renewables, it's still cheaper. So all the construction costs is still cheaper per kilowatt hour to run renewable projects than it is to keep running coal. So these car power ships are an absolute disaster for South Africa's energy systems. They are another example of poor energy decision making. And our Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources, you'll see that in South Africa, they combined mineral resources, which is mining, with energy. So you know that in the mind of that minister, he doesn't separate out mining from energy capacity building, which is exactly the problem that we're facing, because there isn't perhaps there's an understanding, but there isn't political will to make the transition, to make the investment in renewable energy. So it's renewable energy, even though it's the cheapest in the world. And South Africa in particular has a huge opportunity. We could be exporting solar energy. This could be a financial benefit to South Africa, because around the world, they're looking for clean energy access. And yet we remain focused and invested in very environmentally damaging projects like these big offshore ships to produce energy. So yeah, we are highly critical of that development, Mike, and very concerned that this is how our government is using emergency situation because we don't have enough reliable energy, when renewables could have addressed that much more quickly, much more affordably. And even if we did it now, we would see a better outcome, a climate smart outcome, which we're not seeing it. So we're with you, Mike. It's very concerning.
Yeah. And we probably also need to add that, okay, we don't know for sure in this particular example of these power ships, but often these international arrangements and agreements in the energy sector have some element of corruption involved in them. Big interests, big oil companies, big coal companies, big nuclear companies are notorious for acting unlawfully in the ways that they deal with governments in developing countries. So whenever you see your government entering into an agreement with the big energy sector, you really need to be very careful and investigate as much as possible. I see that in the chat box there are a couple of points. The one is if you could show the objectives of the organization again, and maybe when you go back into your slide presentation, you could do that. I just mentioned again that we will make the presentation available to everybody afterwards. And then there's the question around the caged birds. How are you addressing, how do you come up with adequate space for the vast numbers of birds that are being kept in the egg and the poultry industries? What's the practicality of that?
Thank you, Mike, and thanks for those questions. I'll just share this slide again. I didn't present our objectives as such, although we have got very clear objectives for each of our program areas. I was trying not to be too NGO today, but this is sort of our overarching approach that we take. Why we work with faith leaders and what we seek to achieve. So it is our overarching organizational objective, not so specifically within the different program areas. But those are also available on our websites, and I'd be happy to share more information. So the other questions were more around, yes, I think there will be a recording shared, Justina, as far as I know, Mike. I think there's another question.
We will
then,
in due course edit this into a video, which will be made available on our website and our YouTube channel.
Great. And then I was just looking at this question from Anastasia. I'm asking about the issue of space for egg-laying birds. We know that the ideal way to care for birds is so that they can carry out their natural functions. So birds, just like humans, need access to fresh air. They need access to dust. They do dust bathing. It's part of the way that they keep themselves healthy. And they like to perch. You can see these birds here are perching. So they have natural behaviors, which are, they also have quite a complex social system, birds, hens. And if you keep them in a close confined area, what ends up happening is they end up pecking each other and losing their feathers, and they become very unhealthy. That's why we call it a cruel confinement of hens in cages. So in terms of large farms, there are different ways that you can do that. Obviously, the higher welfare for the hens, the better quality eggs you will be producing, the less effluent in terms of hens, waste will impact on the environment. So we are not farmers, but what we are saying is that for the well-being of the hens, for the well-being of the ecosystem, and for the well-being of those who eat the eggs, we want cage-free systems because it has higher hen welfare. Ultimately, one should have a farm which allows hens access to light, allows hens access to the ground. And of course, as soon as you get big industrial farms, which have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of birds, you're seeing a lot of profit. But often that is at the expense of the birds themselves and of the people eating the egg. So you see, as the profit increases for the humans, so the quality of life for the birds and for the quality of the product they produce goes down. So it's not to say that you can't have ethical and really well-run big egg farms. You do have that. And there are examples of that in South Africa and around the world. So it can be done. It's about creating farms that have the right kind of environment for the hens, that recognizes them as living beings, as sentient beings who also deserve to be cared for. So that's, I hope, answering your question, Anastasia. And then Tony asks about food gardening. Tony, you know, the truth is that not everyone is really interested in food gardens, but many are. And it's not so much that we have to come and teach people how to do food gardening, although in some urban situations that is the case. Urban food gardens are something that people may be quite disconnected from. People may not be knowing how to grow their own food or how easy it is to do in an urban setting with just a few containers. In rural environments, what we're really talking about is more of a structural issue. How can we support these smallholder farmers who are growing food for their families? If you've visited smallholder farmers across our region, you'll see very vibrant and very important members of their communities, those who aren't living in urban environments. A lot of youth are moving to the urban environments, and that is their choice. I think it's important that people be allowed to make choices. But if we can see the value in the smallholder farmer and in the value of the food that they produce, then there's an opportunity for us to start thinking about how we produce food differently. There are a number of you who are interested. So you'll see there's some really interesting agroecology networks and groups of individuals who are involved in this, who are making sure that we don't lose that knowledge, and who are trying to find ways to work with government so that those farmers are given incentives to keep that connection with their ecosystem, to farm in a way that doesn't harm the environment and produce that beautiful, nutritious food that many of us like. We like the organic food. We like the food that is grown in a way with the least amount of pesticides and is not necessarily grown in a monocrop, because then it loses a lot of its nutritional value. So yes, water is a problem, in particular across our region, and we have to think about how we use water. And there's all sorts of really very clever things that farmers do around water harvesting and making sure that they're able to sustain their crops. But this is going to continue to become more and more of an issue for all of our communities as climate change impacts. Thank you. I've just remembered that I'm speaking quickly again, and the poor translator, I apologize, translator, for speaking very quickly there. Slow down again.
Okay. I wonder if there are any other questions at this point, or should we perhaps then continue with the rest of your slides, Francesca?
Let's do that.
Okay.
Yeah, so we've started thinking about our work a little bit differently recently, and you'll have seen earlier when I was showing the thematic areas, one of the areas, or rather ways that we work, popped in there. It's the FLEE, the Faith Leader Environmental Advocacy Training. For a time, we thought of it almost as one of our programs, but actually it isn't a program, it's a platform. And what do we mean when we say we work on platforms? Well, really very similar to what CPLO are doing here. We create learning spaces for people of faith to come together and to discuss and to examine issues of shared concern. And it is a training, but the subject matter can vary quite widely. So that's why we want to call it a platform, because it's really a convening space where peer learning and ways of working together develop. And this is, I think, one of the ways that we've been very successful, but also I think it's important to remember that faith leaders, especially ones who maybe aren't formally assigned by their church or formally assigned within their working lives or in their communities to work on environmental issues, they may have a lot of other demands on their time. So we tried to find ways that these projects actually fit within people's interests and something that they can sustain within their community, because it's a personal interest area. So it's not for SAFCEI to sustain, but it is for the faith communities to do so. So the program areas that I spoke of before talk of where SAFCEI works on behalf of faith communities and on behalf of all citizens in many cases to try and bring about changes within decision-making, within the structures of government, of businesses, of faith communities. So it's more of a structural approach, whereas our platforms are actually the space where you find local action, and it can also be to governments. It can also be there, but it might be something just as simple as a food garden, or just as simple as a environmental education workshop. This is the space where the work that faith leaders want to do and people of faith, they lead us. That's what happens within our platform. So the FLEET, or Faith Leader Environmental Advocacy Training, is one of the ways that we work. And when we started Fleet, we were regional, and this is one of the regional fleets. So we had faith leaders from right across the region. And they were individuals who were self-selecting. So they chose to apply. And then we went on a journey with them of training and then practice or action and some more training and some more practice and action. And through that, it's kind of a dialogue that builds up. And those faith leaders learn about SAFCEI's work. SAFCEI learns about their work. And together we find ways that we can take action together. So you can see here that our fleet creates this earth keeping, this movement of earth keepers, people who feel compelled and want to take action within their local community. And here on the left, you can see the bishop blessing the trees that are being planted. Isn't that wonderful? And here on the right, you can see some school children with some earth keepers. They're wearing the SAFCEI t-shirts, doing some tree planting. Tree planting is just one thing. Faith communities decide what they want to do and what their environment needs. And I think ethical action, or finding something you can do in your community, not always trying to do the big picture analysis, is a really important learning. It's also a way of sustaining the work. If you only focus on climate change all the time, I'm sure you all feel the same way. You can get really depressed and despondent and feel that, how are we going to tackle this issue that is so big? But if you plant a tree, you have a wonderful sense of immediate achievement, which is really important. So when we do this training, this fleet training, we are looking for local action that is around, it's not so much about addressing injustice, but it's seeking justice. So how can we inspire each other to restore nature, to restore the human relationships? How can we share stories about what we're doing and help each other do something for ourselves? How can we learn to speak to the press in a way that really tells a compelling story of what we're trying to achieve? This is the sort of work that SAFCEI does with faith leaders. In fact, I want to give all the credit to the faith leaders, because indeed they're the ones who really are taking action in their communities. We're facilitating it and supporting it and growing a movement. We're saying, we see you. We see the important work that you're doing, and we recognize it being really of value. We know that what you want to achieve is going to make a difference. The role of SAFCEI, and how can we support you to do it? So there's a facilitatory role of SAFCEI. We like to talk about big issues together. We learn so much in these spaces because, of course, you as faith leaders have a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge to share with us and each other. So here's some more examples of us meeting together, taking action, learning about things together, and just really showing the wonderful achievements that are happening. So another area that grew up last year during COVID was, and you remember I said earlier on in my presentation, I said, SAFCEI is a multi-faith NGO. And you know, I'm, as you heard, relatively new in leadership. I've been here for about 4.5 years in the role as executive director. And when I started, I used to hear some nostalgia at SAFCEI towards how we used to meet when we were smaller and still quite an organic organization. We used to meet and we would go to the cathedral and find out about the cathedral and meet there, and the Muslim leadership would come with us and the Jewish leadership, and we would learn about each other's faith, as well as what are we doing about environmental action. And in this platform, the Fleet platform, you can see we're focused on environmental action. We're not doing the learning about other people's faiths as much. And while the Fleet, the impact of it has been around peace building. we've definitely seen that when we as multi-faith people look on a central issue together, the differences between us become less important when we're trying to fight that dump. The issue between us are not so important, but actually the richness of the interfaith dialogue isn't there. So what we decided to do last year was to start doing interfaith dialogues. And it's an online platform. We run them every 2 months or so. And last year we started with those 6 thematic areas that I mentioned earlier. And here they are listed again. So this is an opportunity to ask, what does your faith say about energy and climate change? And at each session, which is an online session, anyone is welcome to attend, and you have different faith actors speaking from their faith perspectives. So we're learning, what does the Quran, for example, say about energy and climate change? What is the Pope saying about food security and climate change? What does the Jewish faith say about animal justice? And so each time we met last year, every 2 months, we would have 3 or more faith leaders from different faiths speaking about each issue. And then there would be an opportunity for some dialogue. Very interesting and well-attended space, because it allows us to look at the thematic area, but also come very much from a deep knowledge of the sacred texts of our faith, of the actions of our faith community. It gives a different quality of sharing and a deeper dive into different faiths. So here we are online having one of our interfaith dialogues. And you can see a couple of colleagues there. There's Wayne there, and I'm there as well. And we're busy listening to each other about what does your faith say. And this particular one was for, it was a region of one in a specific area within the Cape Town area. Okay, so what else does SAFCEI do? Well, we also engage with some of these global initiatives. And last year, we weren't able to do our normal Green Action Week. Green Action Week is a website, and hopefully if Wayne's still with us, he can share it. It's an environmental website. It's not a faith website. And you can register. Green Action Week is coming up next week. And you can register to say, I'm taking action. I'm doing something this week. But last year, obviously, we were kept separate. We were kept remote from each other. So we asked our earth keepers around the region to take a picture of themselves to say, what are they doing to take green action? And what are can they please hold a poster up? So here you can see this priest here on the left, he's standing next door to a big erosion site. I found his message very touching. We also have this person of faith, this Green Anglican, who's talking about the work that she's doing in planting trees and food gardens. And then here on the right, we have Safsi founder, Bishop Jeff Davies, talking about what he does. So you can see he's been down at the beach picking up bits of detritus from the sea. So that's what he does. So that was our Earthkeeper picket last year. This year, because COVID numbers are down, we're actually having some physical Green Action Week in 2020. Here's some other examples of how we dealt with COVID. We actually did quite a few, which is interesting, maybe for you, Tony, and others. We did quite a few food gardening webinars, and there's a wonderful permaculture gardener who does agroecology called John Nzira. He's a Zimbabwean that's based in South Africa. And we ran a number of online seminars last year, very, very knowledgeable about how to garden in a way where you have limited space, but you want to grow a lot of different crops, water-wise, and so on. And those videos are on our YouTube channel. So you can go and have a look at those. And you can see the wealth of knowledge that John has shared with us. And we also did, when COVID numbers came down, we did a cleanup for Green Action Week as well. So you can see everyone's there having done a fantastic job. Another way that SAFCEI works is through supporting faith communities directly. And if you have been working with us and are part of our network, last year, because we weren't able to gather together, we wanted to really make sure communities who were feeling that they couldn't take action without some financial support or support for tools, we created a small grants facility, which is about what can you do in your community to take some kind of environmental action. It can be a practical action, as you're seeing here, or it can also be more of an advocacy point. It's something that we want to do more of, to allow faith communities to be self-determining in what actions they need to take. And of course, SAFCEI cannot be everywhere. So this is about helping to ensure actions are able to be taken in wherever people are at and whatever their issues are. We also have been supporting another group on the wild coast of South Africa, which do some amazing food gardening. And the wild coast is a very special part of South Africa. It's a part of Africa that's never been colonized. And so it has the people who live there, the Amapondo, are very in touch with their land, but they're also fighting, unfortunately, some development issues. The government has been wanting to mine that coast of titanium and also to bring some big toll roads into the area. So while they do amazing traditional food practice gardening or growing of crops, they also are fighting some big injustices. And so it's a very beautiful part of the world, and there's a lot to learn in that community in terms of how they are living in the land. So that's the end of my presentation.